So let's say you're hanging out in the village square in 1750s London, and this guy walks up to you and he's all, "Hey, want to see something cool?" And then he pulls out his watch and he goes, "Hey, check it out. It's 3:16, and you're like, "What?" Even after inventing sophisticated tools for measuring time, the Babylonians, Greeks, and Romans had a hard time keeping time accurately, because they relied on people to show up and do the measuring. They used the gnomon and their observations of the sky to develop the earliest known system of timekeeping. The Sumerians divided the daylight hours into 12 sections, and each section was further subdivided into smaller sections. They even developed a device called an armillary sphere to help track the stars. Escapement mechanisms and mechanical clocks were invented independently in China and Europe, but it was in Europe that mechanical clocks really took off. And towers were great for putting clocks in, because they were tall enough that the clocks wouldn't get blocked by buildings or trees. Soon after, the English took the concept and ran with it, developing many improvements to the mechanical clock. When ordinary people did see a clock, they would often assume that it was a sundial-like. Clocks were common in houses and public buildings throughout Europe and America. People would place their own interpretation on what the numbers meant, so you never quite knew what time it was anyway. If you liked this video, you can like and subscribe and leave a comment suggesting a future topic for the series. And if you disliked this video, well, you can dislike it and leave a comment telling us why we totally botched the topic. One improvement was the addition of a pendulum to control the movement of the escapement mechanism. This made the clock much more accurate. The English also developed a spring-powered clock, which didn't have to rely on gravity to power it. There are analog clocks, digital clocks, and even atomic clocks that are so accurate that they lose only 1 second every 100 million years. But no matter what kind of clock you use, it's nice to know that they all agree on what time it is. Well, mostly they agree. Daylight savings time happens twice a year, and sometimes clocks don't agree on whether it's 3:16. This made it possible to make smaller clocks that could be worn on the body. Church bells were also attached to these towers, and the bells would ring out on the hour, telling the local populace what time it was. In order to build a reliable clock, monks would often have to build separate structures next to the tower to house a weight and pulley system that would wind up the clock, and the clock's weight would slowly descend throughout the day, powering the clock. The armillary sphere was a model of the sky with rings that represented the celestial equator, the ecliptic, and the sphere was mounted on an axis so that it could rotate with the Earth. The Sumerians used the armillary sphere to determine the length of the year, as well as the length of time between sunrise and sunset. Before that, people had to rely on things like watches, pocket watches, clocks on the wall, and of course, if you wanted to know what time it was, you had to look around for a clock and hope that it was close to the right time and that you could read it. This helped them keep track of the seasons and plan for planting and harvesting crops. And if that person was 5 minutes late, well, too bad. This allowed them to measure the hours throughout the day. The Egyptians also developed a water clock, which was a container filled with water that had a small hole in the bottom. As the water dripped out of the hole, it indicated the passage of time. The Egyptians used these water clocks to regulate the daily activities of workers who built the pyramids. You just had to assume that the sundial said 5 minutes past whatever it said before. These devices were called candle clocks, and they consisted of a candle that was placed in a socket and surrounded by markings. As the candle burned, it would melt away and reveal the markings. The time was shown by the position of the last visible marking. Candle clocks were pretty precise, and they could be adjusted to take into account changes in temperature. Chinese timekeepers also developed an escapement mechanism, which was a device that controlled the flow of liquid from a water clock. This helped to make water clocks more accurate. It might seem strange that people would put up with such imprecise timekeeping, especially when accurate timekeeping is so essential to modern life. But back then, you didn't need to know what time it was, unless you were a farmer trying to figure out when to plant crops or a businessman who needed to know when a shipment was coming in. The rest of us could usually tell just by looking at the sky whether it was daytime or nighttime, and we knew approximately where we were in the day based on our routines. He's like, "Oh, sorry, you don't have a watch, do you?" A lot of cultures independently invented sundials around the world, including in Egypt, Greece, and China. At its simplest, a sundial was just a stick that cast a shadow as the sun moved across the sky. As long as the stick and the ground it was resting on were both level, the angle the stick made with the ground could tell you roughly what time it was. More advanced sundials had markings on them that would tell you what time it was more precisely. But sundials still had limitations. For example, they were all that useful in winter when the sun doesn't shine as brightly or for as long, and they were completely useless at night. Also, since everyone's location on Earth is different, no two sundials were exactly alike, and they often had to be recalibrated. It's 3:16. And then he just walks away. So now what are you gonna do? You can't tell the time without your watch or phone. Oh wait, actually that won't even help, because before modern clocks there were lots of different kinds of clocks and none of them necessarily said the same thing. Telling the time was complicated. Welcome to my channel, and today we're talking about when time wasn't real. Humans didn't always wear smartwatches that told atomically precise time down to the billionths of a second. In fact, Humans couldn't even agree on what time it was for most of history. Here's how we used to tell time before clocks. Keeping track of time was an important job, but in ancient times it was also an impossible job. The sundial is considered the earliest known timekeeping device, and people have found evidence of sun. Dating back to as early as 3500 BC, Sumerians used a form of sundial called a gnomon, which was basically a pointy thing stuck into the ground. The Egyptians used a type of sundial called a merkhet, which consisted of two gnomons set up at right angles to each other. Chinese timekeepers had a similar idea to the water clock, but instead of water, they used candles. Mechanical clocks, on the other hand, were able to keep accurate time regardless of outside conditions. That's why they became popular during the Middle Ages. In medieval Europe, monasteries were some of the largest buildings, and they often had towers. The first mechanical clock to show the time on a dial appeared in the French city of Paris in the 13th century. For centuries, though, clocks remained expensive and rare objects owned by the wealthy. It wasn't until the 19th century that clocks became more affordable and common in homes. Even today, there are many different kinds of clocks. Thank you for watching this episode of Time Not Being Real.